I don't know how many metaphysicians there are in the world today, but not that many. I think it's a growing movement, but you never can tell. And because of that, I don't think you have to actually call yourself a metaphysician to get this, but I think that that's one thing we, as people who study this teaching, the science of mind, and other similar teachings, all kind of share this notion that is different from what everybody else on the planet thinks. And I don't think in this case majority should rule, because I think we're really onto something here. Most people think that this is a physical universe. And it's really easy to demonstrate that, It feels real, feels like it's solid. It feels like that's what life is. It's the earth circling the sun, rotating moon, oceans, your body relates to all these things. But that's really not the essence of life. There's a higher reality. And that higher reality is that we live in a mental world. If you look at even the way the ancients spoke about this, it could easily be interpreted when it says that in the beginning was the Word, that in the beginning was an idea, that we started from that idea. And that perhaps, if that's how it began, perhaps that's how everything begins. Maybe that's where everything comes from, is ideas and how they're put forth. And when the Christian, Judeo-Christian Bible says that we are made in the image and likeness of God, perhaps what that's talking about is that we have the same capacity to create. Because perhaps there's no difference between us and that divine presence. So obviously this is taking me to the idea of mental equivalence, and you may never have heard that term before, but it's an important concept in our teaching, and it really becomes a principle that we can use to understand how this thing works. And that's what I want to share with you today. I looked back. I've got my speaking notes from all the way back to 2000, and not once did I title a talk with the term mental equivalent. So it's time. But the interesting thing about mental equivalence is that it's not a science of mind originated concept. It actually was originated by a Unity minister named Emmett Fox. And Emmett was a great teacher in his lifetime. He lived toward the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century and had a great impact on this country and how we explored these spiritual ideas. And he wrote a book called The Mental Equivalent. So he's the ultimate expert on this thing, at least at a starting point. And what I want to do is share some words from his writing. The key to life is to build in the mental equivalence of what you want and to expunge the equivalence of what you do not want. How do you do it? You build in the mental equivalence by thinking quietly, constantly, and persistently of the kind of thing you want. And by thinking with two qualities, clarity and interest. We're going to go back to that. The rest of the quote goes on, if you want to build anything into your life, if you want to bring health, right activity, your true place, inspiration, if you want to bring right companionship, and above all, if you want understanding of God, form a mental equivalent of the thing which you want to think about want to think about it a great deal, and by thinking clearly and with interest. Again, he says clearly and with interest. Those apparently are the qualities that he's suggesting that we use. So, interestingly, Fox in the book explains where he got this idea. He got it from an entirely different place, a different way of the world, back in the physical understanding of life, from engineers and chemists and physicists who had this thing called mechanical equivalence, which is a pretty easy thing to understand. Mechanical equivalence is how much electricity does it take this HVAC unit, now that wasn't around when he was there, but this is a current example. How much electricity does it take this HVAC unit to heat this particular house? for a period of 24 hours or an hour, however you want to model it. But it's the idea that you're going from something that is invisible, in that case of electricity, into something you can actually experience, which is either air conditioning or heat. And the equivalent is the measurement of that. And you do this with anything physical that has motion. How much jet fuel does it take for a certain kind of aircraft to fly from point A to point B? That can be calculated. And so the ability to do a mechanical relationship like this is just translated into the spiritual realm, and it still applies. So what is it that we have to provide in our thinking, in our way of being in the world, that is going to create the outcome we want? Now, if you're involved in this teaching and you've heard about spiritual mind treatment, it would be really easy to go to a place that says that it's words that actually create something into your life. But I want to tell you today, the words don't do that at all. Words are symbols that we understand, we use to communicate, but they in and of themselves don't do that. There has to be something more intrinsic, more embedded in us, for us to actually use this incredible ability we have to initiate creation. There are pieces to this, and if you look at our symbol, you can see that there are 3 sections in that circle, and each one represents some part of the creative process. The mental equivalent has to happen in the top, in that place that's invisible, in that place of pure spirit, where there is no physical form. And it has to move through the law, which is at the center of that model, and come down into the bottom, which is physical form. Now, anybody that's engaged in physical form thinks that's where it's happening, in the bottom. But nothing is created in the bottom part of that model. Nothing. Everything is created in the top. And that's what the thing that looks like a V is about. It's actually saying that there's a movement here, a movement from the invisible presence of the divine through the law down into physical form. That's us expressing into life. And then it goes the other way, back up. It goes back up as what we experience from what we expressed. Because everything is a reflection. As Barbara spoke of in the Best of Barbara today, she's absolutely spot on, that everything is simply a reflection of what's going on inside of us. Nothing was created without that. Now, some people who just are first being introduced to this idea can think that there's something about blame going on there, that, oh, that happened to you, well, that must be your fault. That's not it at all. Because every experience is a spiritual experience. There's no wrong ones. And even though the science of mind doesn't address this thing of multiple lifetimes, I can't imagine that you and I are going to come here and live in a body for something under 100 years, and that's it. And then there's nothing more of us. I just don't believe that. I believe that we are that pure spirit in the top of that model. And that because we are that invisible presence, that we are infinite. We are not, as spiritual beings, bound to the limitations of being on planet Earth. We get to come here and play. And we get to do it for a certain number of years. And then we leave. And whatever we choose to do in that playing is not wrong. But there's an advantage to having this thing called, this awareness of this thing called mental equivalence, because it helps us understand how to do this in a way that we want to, rather than just seeing what comes and taking it. So when Fox created this and wrote his book, obviously Ernest Holmes and a lot of other teachers of the day read it and got it, that it was so important. So much so that Holmes called it, well, let's give me one more little graphic to look at it for a second. Holmes called it a spiritual law. Now, I believe that there's only one spiritual law and that you can define it lots of different ways, and that kind of applies here as well. The idea of mental equivalence as a spiritual law, this is what Holmes says about it. He says, we must not only believe, we must know that our belief measures the extent and degree of our blessing being the outcome that we're seeking. So what he's saying is we must know that this thing that we're thinking is so is actually creating the extent and degree of what it is that's coming into our lives, that we're in charge of it. If our belief is limited, then only a little can come to us, because that is what we believe. We call this the law of mental equivalence. So Holmes took Fox's idea and made it a spiritual law, spiritual principle, said that's what it is, and says in his way of interpreting it that the degree of your believing in something determines how much of it shows up. And I believe that's a piece of it, but that's not all of it either. There's more to this. There's something here to understand. And when we understand it, we can use it better. We can rely on it. Golly, I wish kids had this in their lives. I wish that we could teach every child that the thoughts they're having are creating their reality. Not just on the inside, but absolutely on the outside. Then we could maybe stop having to go through all the pain and suffering that we often do. Now, I'm not suggesting that we're going to live these pristine lives where nothing goes contrary to the way we imagined it would go, because things happen, and they happen through us. So that whatever is happening, it's happening through us, because of our consciousness, not because of some outside power that has something over us. It's so easy, if you live in a physical world, to look for someone to blame, for something to blame, to find something that's wrong, something that's not working. And when we do that, all we're doing is we're denying the truth of our being and the power that we wield. If you notice that quote that was up at the beginning from The Science of Mind, Holmes talked about there, about how we're acting like finite beings because we don't really get it yet, that we have this incredible ability to live these amazing lives. And I don't think any of us are wrong for that. It's just where we are in our evolution. But I truly believe that understanding this helps us evolve beyond that, realizing that there's nobody to blame. Even ourselves, there's nobody to blame. There's simply an outcome for what we think. And that outcome is our path. I know of no one that ever had the wrong path. Even people that you and I would kind of wonder why they made it to the planet. You know, the great tormentors out there, the Hitlers and the people like that seem so destined to not support the movement of life on this planet. But even those people were on their perfect path because they helped us realize that's no way to live here. And that by doing that, no one is served. So then we can turn to how are we served? How are we helped into this world to do the things that are ours to do? Well, according to Fox, I want to go back to those two qualities, or qualifiers I'll call them, that he said were necessary. He said one was, the first one was clarity. Absolutely. It's our job to be clear about what it is that we're calling into our lives. And I'll go ahead and have this pitch for desire. Desire and wanting is absolutely important to our process. Otherwise, how would we know what to call forth in our lives? But we do not create at the point of desire. We have to move beyond it. So that's where this clarity thing comes in. We have to be clear about what it is that we're calling into our lives. Oftentimes we think we want something, and when we get it, we go, that's not what I want. But if we're clear about it and we look at it as objectively as we can make better choices in our lives. Rather than thinking that something should happen and that's the only way it should be, that's not true. So the way you move away from that is by focusing on the qualities of the thing that you want rather than the substance of the thing you want. In other words, I mean, on a very base level, if you're creating a new car, you don't want to be holding in mind that a particular car is yours. There could be something about that car that's not going to end up serving, not going to make you happy. What you want is to focus on the qualities of the car that you want. You want to make sure that it has the right kind of braking system or transmission or drive force. And I say it that way because I always think of Eddie and his Tesla and how he sneaks up on people because the car doesn't make a sound. It's wonderful. But however you do it, you set those qualities in mind. You're clear about what qualities you want. And then the right vehicle shows up in your life. And of course, again, this is very basic. But the same thing applies to relationships. Don't get your heart set on one specific person. Know that you want certain qualities in the person that you're spending time with. and I'll get to the other part of that, but what that brings to mind is that we had Reverend Sally Robbins in the room with us last week. Those of you that were here saw Sally. She was with a guy. And Sally shared with us that she's getting married on November 1st to this man. And he seems perfectly wonderful, very amenable. I don't know him, but I enjoyed being in his presence, and it was lovely. She has a close relationship with a minister in Charlotte, an old friend named Reverend Marty, and she was talking to Marty about how quickly this happened, and he laughed. He said, "It didn't happen quickly. You've been planning this for 20 years." Oh, well, yeah. So that's a part of it. It is not our job to run a timeline. We can do that with our goal setting, but when we're creating, this thing will show up when we're ready to have it. And it won't show up before that. So if you have a desire for something or someone, some outcome in your life, with your work or with the place where you live or anything else that's important to you, and it doesn't seem to be coming, there's more work to do. But it's not that you have to work harder. It's not that you have to dig in. Maybe it's something you haven't even considered, and that would be that there's another element to this mental equivalence stuff. And that element is that we must be clear about who we are. And most of us don't do that. We just have a desire, so we put all our focus on wanting to create the desire. We want this thing to show up in our lives, and we don't have to want to change at all. We want to be exactly the person we are with this thing in our life. Doesn't work that way. We have to become the person that can have that and be that in the world. We have to open our hearts. We have to open our lives to being the person that other person wants to be with, or to be with that car that would be driven by somebody that's the right person to drive that car. So the work is not only in envisioning it being a certain way and to create mental equivalence around the outcome that we seek. We also must have healthy mental equivalence about ourselves, about who we are, about what we bring to the world. Anytime that I'm counseling someone on relationships, my key focus is not the person that's going to come into their lives, but the person I'm talking to. How can you, ma'am or sir, be the one that can be in the delightful relationship that you're claiming you want? What's it going to take for you to have that in your life? That's the work. That is exactly as important and meaningful as anything else in this process. So if you want to create into your life, the first place to look is at you. How can I be the one that can have this in my life? How can I have this success? How can I have this abundance? What do I have to be so that I can accept this and enjoy it and share it with others? What do I have to do about me? And when we focus on that, then we're creating a home base for that thing to show up beautifully. And that makes the whole rest of the process quite a bit easier. So I'm very grateful to Fox for coming up with this idea of mental equivalence. I'm grateful for all the cuteness and love in life and the fact that we are the absolute creators of our lives. And that when we let go of thinking that this is about words and we start feeling and seeing in our mind's eye and smelling aromas and fragrances and being able to sense touching this reality that we're calling into our lives, and we can do those things, it's irresistible to the law. I don't know how the law works. I admit that. I just know that it does. And that if you put your clear knowing of who you are and what is in your life into the law, it must respond because there's no conflict. You're the person that can have this, and this is the thing to have. And you put them together, and reality ensues. So work on that this week. Think about what it is that you still want in your life that hasn't shown up. And put your intention, instead of wanting it, put your attention on being the one that can have it. And see where that takes you. See if there isn't something powerful for you in there that you never would have thought about otherwise. And my guess is you're going to have that big smile. You're going to have that full heart. And you're going to live a content life that you were meant to live all along. So let it be so. I love you very much. Thank you.